Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Michael Beschloss, and Lisa Rubin are back with us. You know, before we went to break, what Ruth was saying made me think about the fact that I think that a lot of Americans out here really believe that Donald Trump won't be able to go as rogue as he's saying he wants to. He won't be able to be a dictator on day one, right, or throughout his presidency, because there are guardrails to stop him. And I am most concerned about the fact that there are no guardrails.
There are no guardrails.
There are no guardrails for Donald Trump. Michael Beschloss, like, it is the Congress, under this current Congress, is not going to be a guardrail, and let alone Republicans in Congress. I mean, the Speaker of the House was one of the chief cheerleaders of the insurrection and the Stop the Steal movement. This Supreme Court is not going to be a guardrail. We are still waiting with bated breath for the immunity decision. The guardrails don't exist. Like, who the president is matters. And the staff won't be a guardrail either, because Donald Trump has told us he's not going to hire people that are going to try to hold him accountable, like the generals of his last administration.
Take everything that Donald Trump says extremely seriously. You're absolutely right. Justices on the Supreme Court, we've seen it in the last month, are complicit. They are right now dragging their feet on presidential immunity on this case so that this January 6th case cannot go forward before the election. That's not the only motive, but everything we know suggests that a majority of the justices are perfectly fine with that. That is a big flashing red light. If Donald Trump comes into the presidency and controls Congress, you've seen the way that leading Republicans have reacted to this verdict. They're basically mimicking what he says. The verdict is part of a legal system and a rule of law that's rotten and should be thrown out. You have a presidency. Presidents have too much power in this country. They run the Department of Justice. They run the Defense Department, the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons. If you've got a president who wants to become a dictator, unfortunately, the founders in our Constitution did not protect us. What's going to stop it? Impeachment? How has that worked out? He was impeached twice. It was like a snowflake falling on the Potomac. So all I'm saying is that if Donald Trump is elected, you have to assume that he is going to go right through with his promise to be a dictator, not for a day, but perhaps for the rest of our lifetimes, and at the same time wreck our rule of law that expands our rights and assures that people don't commit murder and arson, and assures that investors want to invest in the United States economy because it's stable. So you've got essentially a dictator who is promising to wreck our system of laws with the complicity of certain people on the Supreme Court, certain people in Congress. And so essentially you had something we have never seen in American history, the promise of dictatorship and anarchy at the same time. Is that what Americans want in November? I don't think.
Lisa, Symone is asking about future guardrails, and I think that is the right question for all of us to be asking, given that what he is doing is setting up a future framework. In real time, I think one of the guardrails is actually fact-checking all of the things that he is saying. You've already fact-checked the idea from him, from other Republicans, that this should have been brought 7 years ago, but that is not the only lie that is embedded in his rhetoric.
There are so many, Alicia, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, I think one of the biggest lies here is that the gag order precluded him from testifying. So let's just break that apart for a second. The gag order, as Judge Merchan told him very patiently, only applies to extrajudicial statements, meaning things you say out of court. To the extent that Donald Trump feels like some ruling of Judge Merchan made it impossible for him to testify, it was because New York State provides for a proceeding called the Sandoval hearing. That means that before a defendant makes a decision about whether to testify, they're entitled to know what the scope of the cross-examination is going to be. During that hearing, Judge Merchan did not give the prosecutors everything that they wanted. In fact, he made it very clear that they weren't allowed to ask him about other accusations of sexual misconduct. But they were allowed, if he were to testify, to ask him about other prior rulings that have come down against him, including the 2 E. Jean Carroll rulings, the civil fraud ruling, and the settlement about Trump University. All of those were fair game because they bear on his credibility and they bear on his honesty with the jury. If Donald Trump wants to get out there now and say that precluded him from testifying, that was his decision and his decision alone. He was in no way blocked from taking the witness stand, and the defense that his side put on to only put on 2 witnesses, one of whom was Bob Costello, who had his own real problems on the stand, that too was their decision. They never called people who would have given an account, theoretically, partial to Donald Trump, like Keith Schiller, his former bodyguard, or Alan Weisselberg, the former CFO of the Trump Organization. They could have called him despite the fact that he's serving a term in Rikers right now. So for all of those reasons, Donald Trump needs to be fact-checked on that and his other characterizations of what happened in that courtroom that I sat in for all 22 days of the trial. When his allies go out there and say, this was a trial that's rigged, I find that funny in part because people like J.D. Vance, who showed up for a morning or an afternoon, sat with their heads in their phones tweeting the entire time. It's not clear to me what they took away from attending the trial other than performatively to say that they were there and then go outside to speak to the cameras. The real people who saw the trial day in and day out, the 100-plus members of the press corps who were there, they have a very different take on what went on within that courtroom. And those of us who were there should continue to bear witness and speak truth to his power.
So in speaking truth to power, this relates back, Ruth, to what Symone raised about guardrails. And the guardrails part of this is extremely important. The problem is the guardrails have been weakened. And I give you Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney, in an interview with the Atlantic's McKay Coppins, noted this. Bragg should have settled the case against Trump, as would have been the normal procedure. You could talk to Lisa about that. Wouldn't have been. But he made a political decision. Bragg may have won the battle for now, but he may have lost the political war. Democrats think they can put out the Trump fire with oxygen. It's political malpractice. For me, the political malpractice are statements like this. Because first off, it goes against the logic of how the case unfolds, and Lisa touched on some of what the defendant can do, what the prosecutors can do. But the bigger picture, Ruth, is the guardrails of that's put in place by those who know better or should know better, who stand in the defense of liberty instead of capitulating to authoritarianism. How dangerous is that piece as we talk about all these other aspects of this if we're continually weakened by current leaders who don't have you-know-what to stand up to someone like Trump? As they said in 2016, now having lived 8 years of this, I would think they'd be more inclined to do it, but they're more inclined to capitulate.
Yeah, this is a symptom of what I'm calling, the moral collapse of Republicans. And what we see from Mitt Romney is that it's extended to kind of blunt the edges of even people who are not MAGA. It shows how, and this has happened in other times and places, years of this has weakened people, and they have moved so far to the right. Even if they're not MAGA, they are still not, they're not old-fashioned conservatives anymore. Old-fashioned conservatives don't back coups to overthrow the government. They don't want anarchy, like Michael was saying before. And, the other points to this is that the MAGA has been waging a parallel information warfare to legal warfare. They're battling in the courtroom, and Trump's has thousands of lawsuits for many years. That's how he operates, way before he was president. But there's also information warfare, and so the reason those clones showed up with the red ties, this is also very fascist. They have to remake themselves in the image of the leader, and physically as well. And that's very scary. And that also shows you how far we've fallen and how these things happen over time. And so the purpose of coming was, of course, to show loyalty to Trump. But the real purpose, that's why Vance was there tweeting, is to disseminate the propaganda talking points, because the GOP is now an autocratic entity and it has a party line. And you've seen how these responses about the trial and the verdict have been very coordinated. And that's something that's also a huge success of Trump's, but a huge, a huge liability for our democracy.
All right, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Michael Beschloss, Lisa Rubin, thank you very much for starting our morning.